April Fool's Day, almost 30 years ago, and what am I doing? I'm standing in front of a double-decker bus in Cardiff with my arms raised in the air, praying that it'll actually stop. So what am I, an apparently able-bodied young man, doing stopping a bus surrounded by people using wheelchairs and all sorts of other mobility-impaired paraphernalia? Well, I'm not able-bodied. I know I'm losing my sight, and I'm there to support my brothers and sisters in the Direct Action Network as they fight for disabled people's rights.
What do we want? What do we want it? No! What do we want?
This was all new to me because I hadn't long been losing my sight, and I was still only just coming to terms with considering myself as a disabled person. I think it started when my social worker said to me, "You're going to have to reevaluate what you want to happen, because if you think you're going to have the same sort of life as you thought you were going to have, now this terrible thing has happened to you, you're going to be a very unhappy young man." And that made me quite angry. And then I met other disabled people, and they helped me realize that this was something that was being done to me. It wasn't my fault. It was an inequality in society, and that we had to do something about it. That's what changed. It changed everything. It changed the way I see things literally, but more importantly, it changed the way I see things inside my head.
Disabled people are disabled by society, and the way that society fails to take into account what disabled people need, and then that leaves and then blames disabled people because they have an impairment.
So society needs to adapt to you?
Well, I think that would be easier than us trying to adapt to society, and certainly more achievable.
I found these people extraordinary. I found them inspirational. As I heard their stories, I realised that many of them who had been disabled from birth had had to fight for everything. For education, for work, for a social life, for love, for everything.
We've shown today that disabled people are no longer weak. We're powerful, and we're going to keep going till we win. We'll never lose.
I, on the other hand, had lived, if you like, both sides of the divide. And I knew that things had started to change when my condition became apparent. People's attitudes had changed towards me. The whole way I was perceived had changed, even though I didn't feel any different inside. And I found this deeply unfair. I mean, it may be a very understandable emotion, but being an object of pity, being a charity case, is not pleasant. I'd done the obvious things. I'd been on a couple of marches, lobbied Parliament, written some articles for disability magazines, but there were people much better qualified than me who had been doing this for years, and we were getting nowhere. So that's how I became a very ordinary foot soldier in the struggle for rights, as disabled people, fed up with not getting anywhere, took to the streets to cause disruption and traffic chaos, to break the law in order to fight for rights, not misery. So why 30 years later, despite all the legislation and despite all the positive changes, are disabled people's rights still threatened? And why 30 years later can we still not take for granted the sort of life we ought to be able to have?
It's just exhausting, and I've only got to fight for others now. I just lose the will for myself.
I'm really angry. Disabled people are still facing systemic inequality, discrimination, of aggression in terms of access to their human rights.
Why did the pandemic hit us harder than any other section of the population? And why has the cost of living crisis proved particularly hard for a group of people who live with lives that are still disabled by a society that will not let them in? And why am I telling this story again? Because every year around International Day of Disabled People, I am dragged out of the cupboard and, like Rudolph at Christmas, given the opportunity to tell my story. But still, here goes. 1995 was a big year, and that action in Cardiff made it feel like a very big day.
That day was kind of preceded, to be honest, by about 20 years of campaigning. I think there'd been nearly 20 attempts to introduce disability discrimination bill in Parliament, but it had never got anywhere really.
This is Rhian Davis, Chief Executive of Disability Wales and a key advisor to the Welsh Government.
There were some big charities who seemed to have the ear of the governments of the day, and their advice to ministers and to government was, well, we don't really need legislation. What we need is persuasion. We need to persuade more employers to employ disabled people, or, to make buildings more accessible or whatever. So there'd been quite a lot of frustration amongst disabled people, and also before that period had been the growth of the disabled people's movement, organisations run and controlled by disabled people, perhaps more directly representative of disabled people's lived experience, and had more of a focus on things like campaigning. The campaign for fully comprehensive and enforceable civil rights legislation gathered momentum, led by disabled people's organisations. Eventually, the government, I think it was the John Major government, finally published a bill, a disability discrimination bill. But I think there was still a sense that perhaps too many compromises were being made. There needed to be more kind of sense of urgency. So I think they're kind of taking to the streets and, disabled people handcuffing themselves to trains and buses was, I suppose, a visceral attempt, really, of showing the public just how much disabled people were just not part of society. It's a very tangible way of showing how disabled people were, physically prevented from being fully part of society. Because if you can't use public transport, well, then you can't go to school, you can't go to, get a job, or, get back your life.
So how about a tangible example of the sort of things disabled people have had to put up with on the transport network?
We've been working with Central Station, British Rail, to get the station accessible, because the lifts there, you had to go down into the basement, into where all the crap was, and the floors were covered in rat poison. So you're pushing through rat poison, gets on your hands, gets on your clothes. It's disgusting, right? So we've been negotiating to have proper human lifts there, They had the plans drawn up, but they wouldn't commit to when they would do it. And so on the BBC News Live, I just said, so when are you going to do the lifts then? When are you going to do the lifts? But he said, oh, we're doing them. Yeah, we decided ages ago to do them. I said, no, you never. I said, you wouldn't give us a date for 3 months, and now you're suddenly giving us a date. They gave us a date because the crap they'd taken in the meantime was more hassle than actually doing the work.
And, news just in, most stations in Wales still don't have complete stair-free access. That was John Luxton, by the way, one of the people who got me involved with the Direct Action Network back in the 90s. I met up with John and another man who was key to my activism, Tony Mackay. Tony, you remember this because London was the first time I was ever dragged in front of a bus, and it was you who dragged me in front of it and just said, walk in front of that and put your arms in the air and hope it stops. The moment of truth when you stopped that train or walked in front of that bus. What went through your head? What did it physically and emotionally feel like?
It was empowering. It was really, to have the kind of support from other disabled people that had obviously experienced that, and to feel as though you could do it and you were being supported to do it. In terms of public support generally, it was very liberating. We had a power during those actions that most disabled people never experience in their day-to-day lives.
I think Tony's absolutely right. I have always felt quite empowered, just the nature of my personality. But, if I felt even more empowered, actually blocking the bus. And the thing that was great was, like you were saying, Tone, all these people who'd never had opportunities, a lot of people have been, so downtrodden and oppressed. They're suddenly in a position where they can suddenly give it to the man, and you could just see it. And people grew through it. And the real person could come out more, because all those things, I'm not good enough, I'm just rubbish, holding them back, were being removed by the sense of physical power. There's nothing that changes more than something that's visceral.
In Cardiff, we'd been fairly active in trying to set up the Cardiff and Vale Coalition of Disabled People. There were other coalitions in Bristol, in Derbyshire, already grassroots movements of disabled people that would have links. It was bringing those people together.
We were standing on the backs of people who'd already done this, right? We got in how to organise. There was quite a few other demonstrations that Tony and I helped organise prior to that.
I think that's one of the things I remember quite well is how nice the people on the buses and the passers-by were.
They're privatising all these companies now. They should put a percentage of their profits in for the facilities of disabled people, and that's it.
They can stop me getting to work.
I wouldn't care.
I'd still agree with
Because our mum was in a wheelchair, we had to take a ride to taxi.
To get her into town, we had to get a taxi for her.
But also kind of how nice most of the police were.
There was a lot of nice, good nature on the Cardiff Dan action. But that's not the case for all areas. Some of it was dreadful, and sometimes the public were awful. I got verbally attacked by fascists, saying I was a useless eater. We had bus drivers sometimes who refused to turn their engine off. People are then scared in case they screw up on the clutch or something, and then you're going to get run over. It was not all nice at all. There was the Birmingham was the most aggressive when people were shouting at us, people getting off the bus and getting unhappy. It was not, Cardiff was exceptional.
They were heady days. We had seemingly a huge amount of public support in terms of the non-disabled community, something we can now look back on in a slightly rose-tinted kind of way, but they were days where we thought there was going to be a real change.
And there needed to be a change because cynical acts against disabled people were not a thing of distant memory. We called this programme Not Really Human because that was the description attached to the file of a profoundly deaf boy at a Welsh special school. Not back in Victorian times either. That was in the 60s. I'm as angered by that now as I was when I first came across it. Does it still have the power to shock? I was given a lot of photographs that were taken at a school for deaf children, and it said, barely more than an animal, high propensity for evil. Who writes that about a 12-year-old boy? And I think that attitude of treating disabled people, particularly disabled people who couldn't communicate verbally, as if they were a lesser life form, casts a long shadow.
Yeah, definitely. And all of this happened, relatively recently in history as well, didn't it? It's not, 60s and 70s, things like that was still going on. Institutions, lack of any sort of consent there for your own decisions. It's all very sad and a very dark point of history that I don't think people know about.
This is Jake Sawyers, a young, sight-impaired actor, writer and content creator. And I was keen to ask whether our experiences had any similarities despite being a generation apart. One of the things that happened to me when I was losing my sight was I suddenly had a social worker, and I met my social worker for the first, and as it turned out, the last time, and she gave me a card with the first 10 letters of the Braille alphabet on it, just the first 10, and she said, see how you get on with those. And I thought, wow, and if I'm really good, I get the rest, like a prize.
Incentive.
And then she asked me, she wanted to send me away for a 3-month training course. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. I've got life to get on with and work to get. And she sort of said, now you need to think again, because if you think you're going to have the same sort of life as you thought you were going to have before this terrible thing happened to you, you're going to be a very unhappy young man. And I felt I was being condemned to some sort of second-class life. And I wondered if that had ever happened to you.
Oh, yeah. And what year would that have been?
That would have been 1989.
Yeah, so I was born in 94, and I think I was diagnosed in about 95. And my parents were told by my consultant, Jake will never live a normal life. Jake will never kick a ball. Jake will never play with the boys. And that last one I always find hilarious. But yeah, I just think back to that moment. My parents instantly decided, right, we don't want to see you again. He will live a normal life, and they decided I would. But I always think about the film of my life where they believed him and how 100% different my life would be. I think it's such a dangerous thing to tell a parent, to tell a person, because these are professionals who will believe unless you have the willpower not to. And it's terrifying what could have been for both of us, I guess.
Catching a bus is easy. However, if you're me, seeing which number it is far more difficult. Never mind, eh? Just ask your friendly neighbourhood bus driver. Excuse me, mate. Is this the number 42? Can't you effing read? Yeah, I'm reading Ian M. Banks at the moment. Who are you reading? Well, don't be funny with me, pal. Effing read that. I'm visually impaired. Partially sighted. I'm half blind, mate. I can't read the number. Oh, I'm sorry. Terribly sorry. Well, I mean, you don't look it, do you?
20 years ago, I made that recording for another BBC show marking International Year of Disabled People. Things have changed, haven't they? Here's another recording Jake made recently.
Why using the disabled toilet? You're not even disabled, mate. And at this point, if you haven't slapped them first, you'll say, oh yeah, and what qualifies you to make that decision? Because I could just say, yeah mate, I'm blind, but why should I have to disclose my disability to a complete random who clearly doesn't get it?
People don't necessarily know we're disabled people until they kind of either notice something weird or we announce ourselves. Is that something you relate to?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it does fall into the category of invisible disabilities. And I know that it's not exactly what it is because it's more of a sensory thing. But often when I enter a room, people don't know that I'm disabled and it feels like this little secret that is my decision to disclose or not.
20 years ago, I was, if you like, one of the first wave of disabled disability equality trainers going out there and talking about it to people from the point of view of the social model.
Yeah.
I know that you do a lot of training today. I wonder if the questions have changed or if the basic starting point has changed or whether you still find you're starting from quite a low level.
Yeah, I feel like the people who get the training often already have a solid grounding. And I feel like the people who really need the training are the people down the pub, the people standing on the bus stop, who will probably never get the training or the exposure to ask the right questions or, witness the right things to sort of have their own realisation.
So I'm wondering if what we really need is a more everyday kind of way of going about some of these things so that everybody can be a little less uptight about it and a little more relaxed, because that's half the problem, isn't it? People are so terrified of saying the wrong thing, they don't say anything.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's such an attitudes thing. Policies and things can be put in place for disabled people, but until it trickles down into the people's belief system, it's really not going to make much of a difference.
Jake is aware of the battles that were fought more than a generation ago to get the Disability Discrimination Act on the statute book. And he's aware that there's still a long way to go. Disability Wales held its annual conference recently, and today's campaigners are under no illusions about the scale of the task ahead.
I'm Natasha Hurst, a freelance photojournalist and the president of the National Union of Journalists. It'd be great to say that the Disability Discrimination Act sorted everything out. Obviously that's been taken over now by the Equality Act 2010, but disabled people are still facing systemic inequality, discrimination, of aggression in terms of access to their human rights, so I'm afraid it's not sorted out at all.
My name is Kat Watkins and I am the UNCRDP Development Officer for Disability Wales. I do remember seeing lots of news reports of people on buses and things like that, and I do remember saying to my dad, I wish I could be one of those people. But I didn't know what it all meant back then, because I was only 9. When I do have some form of discrimination against me, which is a regular daily occurrence, to be honest, it used to make me feel really angry, and then it would make me feel really upset, and now I'm just like, oh, for goodness sake, not again. For myself, I reached that realization, but when I see other people being discriminated against, I get really angry, I get really upset, and I do something about it, but I'm really bad at doing it for myself because I've been fighting for so long for it that it's just exhausting.
I'm really angry. I'm really angry that disabled people don't have access to their rights. I'm really angry that it is so easy for the UK government to just dehumanise us, to disregard us, to think that it's perfectly okay to let disabled people exist in poverty, to die. We are people, we are human beings, and we have the same rights as everybody else, and that should be respected and upheld by our government.
Natasha Hurst is not alone in feeling angry. A United Nations review found that the UK's welfare reforms had adversely affected disabled people. And the COVID pandemic brought a new focus. 60% of those who died were disabled people, and the figure was 68% here in Wales. Those figures prompted action, and a new task force linking the Welsh Government with disabled people's representatives has been established. John Luxton, nearly 30 years after handcuffing himself to Cardiff buses, is a task force member.
So we've now got a task force with 9 working areas in co-production with Welsh Government department heads, ministers, local authorities and other bodies that actually deliver the work. Now this is really wide-reaching. This is really about embedding social model in public sector organisations and in government completely. It's about changing the justice system, changing the way police treat domestic violence against disabled women. They treat it as a safeguarding issue, not as a criminal one. Education. And the action plan will be very hard-hitting, and it'll be hard-hitting against Welsh Government. Certainly the NHS, we're already putting things in place regarding the NHS. And there's also philosophical issues that we have to deal with as a disabled people's movement, which we have never done. Utilitarianism. The number of dead people in COVID, was it because of utilitarianism? The utility of an individual, what that person can do, will determine what kind of care they will get. So when NICE brought out their guidelines, anyone who had any kind of personal assistant, whether they had a condition that would affect their life expectancy or health, would automatically be banned from a resuscitator. So if I went in there, I would be banned and I'd be left to die. So again, that's a philosophical area we're challenging, and we did that at the time, and we changed all the Welsh guidance to be based on human rights. There's areas where we can make change, but some areas are very long, because we're talking about culture change.
Rhian Davis of Disability Wales is also part of the task force.
I suppose there's a veneer of inclusion, and I would have said up until about 2010, progress was being made. The Act had been broadened out. There was a Disability Rights Commission, felt that the disabled people's movement had a more powerful voice. A couple of things happened. There was the crash that then led to austerity. A lot of the gains that were made in terms of a recognition, of the rights of disabled people, and we've seen like a rowing back of it. Disabled people were seen as high ticket items in terms of public expenditure. And then, of course, then we went into COVID and lockdown. What's emerging as a result of the COVID inquiry, it's just total disregard, of disabled people. We completely reverted to a medical model without any understanding or recognition of how other disabled people would fare, but, by not having even access to basic things like food, let alone other forms of support. And of course, we've got the cost of living crisis. So on top of that, I think things have gone backwards in terms of recognition of disabled people's rights. I suppose what we were campaigning for in the 80s and 90s was the future generations of disabled people would have more opportunities. It's quite dispiriting when you talk to younger disabled people experiencing very similar issues, really. They may have been more likely to have gone to a mainstream school and had more of a chance to go to university. But in terms of things like employment, getting your own home, access to the level of personal support that you might need, I think we're still a long way from achieving those goals.
Back to one of those young disabled people, Jake Sayers. But it appears that some things take longer to change and more than just the law, and some people handcuffing themselves to buses. Do you feel that you come after a wave of people who protested for rights?
Yeah, personally I do. And I think being a gay man as well, it's very much the same situation there. you've got to be aware of the people who came before you and fought for the world that you currently live in. It feels like some great work has been done, but there is still echoes and things creeping back up, I think, as well. I think even that work that was done earlier on is trying to be undone by a lot of systems and you know, governments and people around the world, which is something that maybe will bring back that focus and that energy to, you know, consolidate and safeguard those rights that are already there, I guess.
Hopefully Jake and other people of his generation won't have to chain themselves to trains and buses in order to make their point.
You were removed from the station, Cardiff Queen Street station, causing an obstruction to the train.
Well, actually, the station was the obstruction, so I couldn't actually access platform 3.
Yeah.
But if they do, they should beware the company they keep. Obviously there was a big police presence. Was there ever any sense that people knew we were coming?
Only in hindsight that we realised that there may have been someone on the actions that wasn't necessarily a supporter, but was instead someone who was passing on information to other agencies. There was a guy who had become part of the group that would meet after the day's actions to plan the following day's actions. This guy was a wheelchair user. A few years later, I was coming out of a high street, so went across the car park and saw this guy who wasn't in a wheelchair, was walking quite confidently, dressed in a fairly dapper pinstripe suit, spotted me and changed direction immediately. Before I could ask, how are things now that you're no longer a disabled person, seemingly?
Well, I think it's something of a mark of respect that finally, after being ignored for so many years, a group of disabled people were considered that subversive and that dangerous.
We've got to celebrate it. You know, we're that big, we got when people try to infiltrate us, I love it.
What do we want? Civil rights. When do we want them? Now.
So in one sense, we've come a very long way from being described by qualified medical professionals as not really human. In theory, we have rights and equality of access to all walks of life. But as the COVID inquiry is revealing, when push comes to shove, we are still viewed as ultimately disposable and dispensable by people in power. Collateral damage on the altar of a prosperous economy. So maybe not considered quite so human after all. In theory, everything has changed for disabled people. But in practice, I'm not so sure. I'm Chris Talley-Evans. Not Really Human was a Steve Groves production for BBC Radio Wales.